All summer, we have been using the Devar Torah slot in each Shabbat service to spotlight a different prophet. Tonight, as our summer sermon series comes to an end, I'd love to explore with you something really interesting about the way Jewish tradition views prophecy in general, and we'll also get to a couple specific prophets. We've been talking a lot this summer about how, according to the Talmud, there were exactly and only 55 prophets. Some were women, some were men, some were Jewish, some were not, but there were only 55. What this means in part, and this is the part I'd love us to explore together a bit tonight, is that according to the Talmud, the era of prophecy was finite, and for now it's over. We don't live in a time of prophets, and we have not for thousands of years. But wait, you might be thinking. I hold by the definition of prophecy articulated in Simon and Garfunkel's 1964 hit song, The Sound of Silence. And according to that definition, prophecy is alive and well. Hold that thought, but for now, let's go with the idea, or explore the idea, which we see first in the Talmud, that at a certain point in world history, the spirit of prophecy departed from the earth, to use the words of the Talmud. Where did prophecy go? And why did it go? In a moment, if anyone has burning ideas about this, I'd love to hear them. But first, let's take a quick look at the time period. The last prophets, or more to the point, the last people universally recognized by subsequent Jewish generations as prophets, were three people named Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. They lived in the time we call the early Second Temple period, or sometimes the Persian period. What was going on in this time period? Shortly before this period, in 586 BCE, the Jewish community of Jerusalem was exiled to Babylon when Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonian Empire. This is called the Babylonian exile, and many prophets were extremely active during this time. A lot of our tradition's most poignant writing about loss and hope and resilience comes from prophecies offered during the era of exile, or later commentaries on these prophecies or other writings from this time. About 50 years later, King Cyrus conquered the Babylonian Empire, and the exiled Jewish community was allowed to return home to Jerusalem. Some did and some did not. This time period was the beginning of there being two major centers of Jewish life in the ancient world, Babylon and Jerusalem, and there have been at least two major centers of Jewish life ever since. The people who made it back to Jerusalem began to work on rebuilding the temple, a central place where Jewish people would travel to communicate with God for the next 500 plus years until it was destroyed by the Roman Empire. Haggai and Zechariah were prophets from the time period when the temple was being actively rebuilt, when people had just returned home and they were trying to restore their lives and restore their practices. And Malachi is a prophet from the era when the temple had just been rebuilt and was in active use once again. And as a sidebar, we won't get into it, Malachi means messenger, and so there's a hot debate in Jewish tradition about whether that was his name or whether it was a name for someone else, but we'll leave that to the corner for today. We could look another day. So now that we have all that background, these last three prophets, two of them come from the time when the temple was being rebuilt, and a third comes from the time when it was sort of up and running again. I'd love to ask again, and if anyone wants to raise their hand, hear what a couple people think. If we accept the premise from the Talmud that prophecy left the earth after the deaths of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, why did it leave? Why were they the last prophets for a while? Any guesses? That's fair, we're in the sanctuary. It's like harder to pull guesses than in the Mishkan. I'll move on.
Tell her after.
Tell me what you think. There's a follow-up question though, which is this. How should we feel about the absence of prophecy in our world today? Should we mourn prophecy? Should we wish that all of us were prophets all the time? Should we feel wistful about it, or happy about it, or neutral? So our tradition, as you might expect, has multiple theories about how and why prophecy left the earth, and also multiple perspectives on how we should feel about it. The Talmud discusses this a few times, sometimes with explanation and sometimes without. On Sanhedrin 11a and Sota 48b, the Talmud floats the idea that actually, long after Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, there were still people capable of prophecy, but their generation wasn't worthy of prophecy, or maybe their generation wasn't ready for prophecy. In this view, prophecy is something that needs more than just the prophet itself, more than just a person who, in the ancient world, they believed had the ability to talk to God and then tell people what God was saying. In this view, prophecy also needs listeners and a society ready to act on what they hear, to be responsive to it. Another slightly more upbeat idea, rather than that the world wasn't ready for prophecy, appears elsewhere in Jewish thought, and it's that maybe the time of prophecy ended after Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi because people didn't need prophets so much anymore. Maybe they already had what they needed to go forward more independently with less direct advice about what to do next. They had a shiny new temple where they could communicate with God, and after that temple was destroyed, they still had the Torah and prayer and acts of loving kindness, and their own ability to figure out what to do next. They also had the ability to talk with each other and learn from each other and argue, and to try to move forward not based on the words of one individual, but on the basis of the wisdom and the passion of an entire group of people who were all trying to do the right thing together. We still have all of those things too. The idea that maybe prophecy ended because we were ready for it to end, because we were ready for some next step, is one that mostly developed in the Middle Ages and beyond, but we can see glimmers of it in the Talmud itself. In Tractate Megillah, in the same part that discusses the idea that there were 55 prophets and only 55 prophets, the Talmud asks, were there really only 55? And interestingly, the answer that it gives is no, which sort of makes sense if you think about it, because in all of these ancient stories in the Bible about prophecy, sometimes they need to prove they're a prophet, but rarely does someone come up to them and say, "What do you mean you can talk to God? I've never heard of this before. How could this be?" And we might infer from that these people were living in a world where that was actually thought to be possible. And given that the 55 prophets lived hundreds of years apart from each other, the extra step from that could be that actually there were a lot more. So the Talmud says that once there were hundreds of thousands of prophets, but the ones whose words were preserved were the ones whose words would be needed by future generations. It's an idea that's kind of radical and bears repeating. Our tradition preserved the words of the prophets whose messages would be relevant to subsequent generations, to us, and it let go of the words of other prophets, most of the prophets, hundreds of thousands of prophets, whose messages were more directly for the people of their own time. There are two aspects of this framing that seem pretty profound to me. First, it contains an acknowledgement that sometimes ideas or ways of living that might serve one generation well are not necessarily needed by their descendants, or not in the same way. This is actually a pretty complex idea, because sometimes when something that was important to a previous generation does not work for us, at least not in quite the same way, it can be tempting to just dismiss it entirely. Because otherwise, if we acknowledge it had any merit, but we're not engaging with it, it might be sort of threatening or sort of scary that we're not doing it. Those silly people from the past, you wouldn't believe what they used to do and say and think. And sometimes this kind of response might be very warranted, but other times the Talmud is perhaps suggesting we can say something milder, like, "I'm so glad that worked well for them. I'm going to figure out what works well for me, and it might be different from that." But we didn't let go of everything from the past. 55 ancient prophets had their words preserved. And this feels profound too in a different way. When we are going through hard times, even unprecedented times, there is a suggestion from the rabbis that one of the places we can look for wisdom is in the teachings that we have received from others, including people who came before us. The prophets were preserved because future generations would need their words. What would it be like to believe that much of the wisdom that we need to live a good life is in our world, waiting for us to find it? This is a question that I think a lot about personally, because I often feel, and maybe you sometimes feel too, like many of the challenges we are currently facing don't have a precedent in my own lifetime. They weren't necessarily the challenges I grew up believing would be the challenges of my adult life. That can feel overwhelming, but the overwhelm can't be the end of the story. It demands creativity and collaboration, and also maybe attention to history and to ancient story. The idea that the ancient prophets are still relevant to us today isn't a suggestion that we'll find precise instructions for our time in their words, but instead that there are threads in their words that we can pull on and learn from and build from, in dialogue with our moment and in dialogue with one another, that we can use it to spark ideas and possibility. In the mid-20th century, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel breathed new life into the prophets, writing a fiery and long book about their relevance to his time. His work shaped not just his own activism in the civil rights movement, the movement for Soviet Jewry, and beyond. It also shaped the thinking of many of his contemporaries who really gave the prophets an honored place in their struggles to make the world a better and different place. We are in another very exigent moment, and our needs are unique to this time. But my hope for us is that, like Rabbi Heschel and so many before him and after him too, we too can pull on the threads of the prophets and other teachings we have inherited from all sorts of walks of life as a source of wisdom and strength. Our Summer of Prophets sermons is ending, but the prophets will still be with us in many ways. We can call on them anytime we need, and I hope that we will. Shabbat Shalom.